Is a local resident producers program. The program content is the sole responsibility of the producer and does not necessarily reflect the views or policies of CATV2, Oshkosh Community Access Television, the City of Oshkosh, the Oshkosh Cable Television Advisory Commission, or Time Warner Cable.
Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of Eye on Oshkosh. Cheryl Hentz along with Dan Rylance, and we're very pleased to be joined on this edition by Miles Maguire. Most of you probably know Miles, and this evening he's here not as a blog operator, not as a journalist, but as a private citizen. For anyone who watches city council meetings, you know that there's been some discussion recently about sidewalks, specifically in the River Mill Road area, which is right off of Arboretum Drive. Miles is one of 40-some residents who live over there. He has taken exception to the sidewalk issue, not because he doesn't want sidewalks, but he's upset with the process. He's bothered by the timing of the sidewalks being put in. So we are going to discuss that issue with Miles tonight, and then in the second half of the show, Mayor Frank Tower will be here to share with us why he voted as he did. He was one of the people who voted for the sidewalks at this time. So, Miles, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it.
Glad to be here.
I guess one of the very first things is, you know, the sidewalks have been approved, and people might say, why have a show about sidewalks? It's a done deal, over with, they're going in. But Dan and I talked about this when deciding whether or not to do the show, and I guess our feeling was it lends some insight into the mindset of the councilors and their decision-making process, and you know, and trying to figure out why this came about in the first place. And we'll never know that. Only Paul Esslinger knows that. Paul, of course, is the one who brought forward a resolution. Was that in April? I'm thinking it was back in April originally.
I think that's when the talk began. I'm not sure when the resolution came out.
He brought forward a resolution ordering in sidewalks, originally just on River Mill Road. And then there was a vote that night that was 5-2 to formally bring it back at some later date. And it came back last month, in the early part of June, I believe. And at that time, it was approved, along with some other streets, by a vote of 4-3. And the person who changed his vote was Brian Bain. Those in the minority were Burke Tower, Jess King, and Brian Bain. Bain had originally voted as part of the 5 for the sidewalks, I guess, because he felt that maybe there was a safety issue there. But then some other things he said had been brought to his attention, and he wanted Public Works to take a look at the overall safety picture. And so he wanted to kind of wait until they could get back to the council. So anyway, you know, why don't you, I kind of told folks, I think already, what you're really kind of upset about, but why don't you tell folks?
Okay, well, what I'm glad that you said was the first thing, that, you know, this issue is done, and we're not arguing about that. The substantive decision has been made. We may not be happy with it, but, you know, we'll live with it. What is, I think, more perplexing and of concern is how the decision was made, what the politics were, and kind of the disparity between what was said as the reason why we're doing things and kind of the facts on the ground, as you might say. So, for example, I think the history of this goes back, actually, there was another project, or there is another project that's currently going on, Lark and Arthur Street, that neighborhood, which is an interesting neighborhood. It's one of those areas that has very poor streets and was also lacking curb and gutter and sidewalks. And the story that I'm told, I didn't actually attend the hearing or see it, was that some of those residents came to the council, said, we don't really want this, it's expensive, et cetera, and why not River Mill Road, you know?
Only one. Only one man said, what about on River Mill?
And there is a difference right there, and I think that's important, that Lark and Arthur, those streets, the streets themselves are in terrible shape, and they need to be repaired. River Mill Road, we have a very nice street.
A wide street.
And we have curb and gutter, so we're kind of halfway there. It's just the sidewalks that we're missing. So the issue is then, why are we doing this, and why are we doing it now? One of the arguments that's been raised is that there's a safety issue because, of course, the Weewash Trail comes through there, and just on its face, there's no safety issue there because there's no traffic. People don't drive through there. We do have people who come from other neighborhoods to walk on River Mill Road because there's no traffic. It's sort of like a little track that people walk around just to get a little exercise. But then the other issue, and I think this may have been what was in Brian's thinking, if you look at the whole trail system, there are some areas, and there's one very close by area that is a safety concern, and that's where, depending on how you look at it, it's Summit south and Arboretum north of Congress. You're right by the bridge there. People come whipping down Algoma Boulevard and think that they're at the Monte Carlo or something, speeding around. And I'm a regular trail user. 2 times or more a day, I'm trying to make that intersection crossing, and it's dangerous. So, if there's a safety issue, that's the bigger safety issue. And if safety is the concern of the council, then why aren't you addressing the issue where it's clear that there are some safety problems?
Which was brought up by some of your neighbors, that
Right.
this is really the issue, is Congress.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and it's not just that particular area, and you brought some photos, and we're going to zoom in on those. I'm not sure at what point you want
Whenever.
to show those. I mean, maybe we could show right now
Okay.
the one that you were specifically talking about
Okay.
by Congress and so forth, because there are a number of areas around town, and this is the argument that a lot of people are making, is that there are a number of areas around town. We'll hold it up.
Hold it up?
Yeah.
Okay.
There are a number of areas around town where
Maybe just lift it up a
there
little bit.
is
Okay.
much more traffic than what you have on River Mill Road, and there are more
Okay.
pedestrians than there are on River Mill Road, and yet, they don't have sidewalks either.
Right.
And so I guess we're getting the camera focused in on this now, and there we go.
Miles, for our viewers, what photo is this of?
Okay, so this is looking west on Congress. So this intersection is actually where the trail crosses Congress. So in the background there is Fratello's, and as you can see, there's a goodly amount of traffic, and there's sidewalks, but there's no way to really get across the road, and there's no traffic light there either, or speed bumps, or there's a pedestrian crossing sign, but that's about all there is there.
Yeah, and and because that is such a wide street, and it is a major thoroughfare, people do fly down that street.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, I can't imagine that anyone goes the speed limit down that road. You've got some other photos as well of areas around town that don't have sidewalks. Some in areas where there are grocery stores, like Piggly Wiggly and Pick and Save.
I didn't bring those pictures, but here's one that I like. This is actually a park. Whoops.
It's coming up.
There we go.
Other way.
There we go. City-owned property. This is at the end of Bauman, just below Sawyer Creek, where Sawyer Creek comes into the Fox River. Little city park there. So if we're concerned about safety, and we're concerned about pedestrians or kids playing, we should probably at least have some curb and gutter there, so that some car coming around the corner there doesn't stray into the park. And why not sidewalks while we're at it?
And again, we should make the point, as you just did, that is a city-owned park, and why is the city not following its own ordinance and putting in sidewalks, and why is Mr. Esslinger not bringing forward a resolution to order in sidewalks there?
Yeah, I mean, there are other pictures, and this is a stretch of the trail north of the River Mill Road neighborhood. This is city property. You can see that there's a runner using the trail, no sidewalks, no curb and gutter, but vehicular traffic, and so again, there are some safety issues associated with the trail. We just don't see a rush to do anything about it. So, Brian's proposal was to do a study of this. This would have delayed the installation of the sidewalks, but I'm not sure why that's a problem. And again, I think one of the concerns that I have as a citizen and a taxpayer is why and how did this decision get made, and why can't we get a straight answer about what's going on here? Some of these safety issues, I should also say that my neighbors have brought forward. One of my neighbors was on the, not sure which, there's a traffic review board, and specifically asked that a traffic light be considered at that site. Certainly at the public hearing, a number of my neighbors did express some concerns about related safety issues. It's just that there's not much traffic on River Mill Road. It's just kind of a circle, so there's not much of a safety issue there.
Well, and before I let Dan jump in here, I just want to make the point again that at least for yourself and a number of your neighbors who came to the city council meeting and who I have, spoken with some of them as well, it's not so much we don't want sidewalks, it's the timing of things. I mean, granted, there were some who didn't feel that there should be sidewalks on River Mill Road at all. But that doesn't seem to be the majority opinion, if you will.
Right. And I think there were, one issue is why now, and the other is there are a lot of streets, and I have other pictures, where we have a sidewalk on one side of the street but not the other side of the street. So if you're concerned about safety and you want to do something right away, why not put the sidewalk on one side and not the other side?
Just a couple of specifics. How many feet of sidewalks are on your property? I mean, what's the length?
I don't know.
Okay.
It's a relatively small lot.
Do you know what the cost is to put sidewalks in your
It's
property?
going to be $800 to $1,000, somewhere in there.
What options did the city give you, either to do it themselves or somewhere else, or payment time period? Can you go through that process?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of, if it weren't so irritating, it would be amusing. We got a letter saying, oh, you can do this yourself, as long as you have a contractor lined up by July the 3rd. This was like, 2 weeks before that. As long as you have a contractor lined up by July the 3rd, then you can do it your own way. Otherwise, we're going to come through and do it. And of course, in the height of the construction season, there's no way in the world that you're going to get, because it's got to be a bonded, contractor. And of course,
Can you spread out the payments through the city at a higher interest rate, or is that like they do with streets? Or?
You can. I think if your cost, there's some cutoff. I think it's $500. So you have to pay the first $500, first certain amount of money, and then if it's a next increment, you can spread it out over a certain period of time. If it's more than that, there's a longer increment.
And I think the project itself, the total cost has to be over $300, I think, in order to spread it out at all.
Yeah, it's 3 or 5 or something. I'm not sure what it is.
Yeah. Well, Dan is going to bring up a couple other things, but the sidewalks, I guess that's where some confusion comes in, because how did your neighborhood not have sidewalks in the first place?
Right.
I mean, we've heard a lot of different things about this. How long have you lived in the neighborhood?
I've lived there for 10 years.
Okay.
And I have to admit, I'm from the East Coast. I'm from a city, from Baltimore, and I'm used to sidewalks. And when I moved into the neighborhood, I thought it looked a little unfinished. I thought, well, that's odd. There are no sidewalks here. There's curb and gutter, but there's no sidewalks. Oftentimes you'll see a neighborhood that has neither curb and gutter nor sidewalks, but it's a little bit odd to see one. We moved in 10 years ago, and I guess the community is maybe 10 years older than that. So it was developed and planned out in the mid-'80s. There seems to be a mystery, but what I've heard is that the council at one time ordered sidewalks in year by year, and that got to be just a hassle, so it stopped doing that, and then decided again 3 years later to have sidewalks everywhere. So the development was platted and planned during this window
when you didn't have to put in sidewalks.
When you didn't have to put sidewalks in.
Yeah.
And so consequently, your neighborhood just sort of fell through the cracks in the sidewalks, if you will.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. All right. And by the way, were Was your neighborhood scheduled to have sidewalks at some point? I mean, did you have an actual definitive time frame from the city?
No, and I thought that the city apparently also has a list. Some 5 years or so ago, the city said, boy, there are a lot of problems, and instead of fighting about this, let's put together a list of certainly streets where there's a lot of traffic, and let's make sure that we've got sidewalks there, and we'll put together this prioritized list and go through. For whatever reason, River Mill Road was not on that list. And so one of the solutions that I thought was reasonable, if the city wants sidewalks, then put us on the list. And when you deal with those high traffic areas and you get around to us, we'll live with that. That might be 4 or 5 years, but, what's the rush?
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think they voted really to put sidewalks in River Mill Road? I mean, this is a talk show with issue. I mean, you're obviously not pleased with it. What's your gut? Where do you think the impetus really came from?
I don't know, and although it is a talk show,
A lot of people say they don't know.
my training as a journalist gives me great caution and pause in terms of imputing motives to people.
I understand. This could be an editorial journalist piece.
Right.
Well, the Northwestern has editorialized about what they thought.
Yeah.
They felt that it was Paul Esslinger with some kind of political payback because John Delantonia, who used to be on the council, who used to be mayor, lives in this neighborhood as well. There was a lot of talk about the haves and the have-nots, and that it's a class issue. I don't know that has anything to do with it. I mean, I guess we'll never know. I just, it's interesting to sit back and look, because I can't really recall a time, and I know that I've talked about this with other people too, and they're struggling to think of a time when the city, in recent history anyway, has ordered in sidewalks, or I should say when a councilor has brought forward a resolution to order in sidewalks like this. And the Northwestern's called it micromanaging on Paul Esslinger's part.
I don't think anybody can prove what Paul's motivation was, and so I guess you have to let him speak for himself. But the arguments, the principles that have been articulated as justifying this, as I said, they don't square with the facts on the ground. We talked about the safety issue that a number of the councilors said, that's why what we're concerned about, the connection with the trail. But there was never any study that was done to identify safety issues. And and I guess the neighborhood would feel better if maybe if the city went out and talked to some of the people who use the trail and asked them, is this a concern for you? And I think that we would feel better if somebody could at least demonstrate that either there's a safety concern or there's a true safety issue. There's not there. Another issue or another argument that has been fought forward is that cities have sidewalks. And as I said, I'm not completely opposed to that idea. It's just that there are a lot of places in the city that need sidewalks pretty badly, either for aesthetic reasons or for safety reasons, or if not sidewalks, traffic lights or something. So if that's the issue, then resolve those issues. It doesn't make sense to come to River Mill Road under those circumstances. So you'd like to think that there's some principles involved. One principle that seems to be out there is that we're going to treat everybody fairly, and every neighborhood gets to be the same, which is sort of like saying, we run roughshod over the blue-collar neighborhoods, so now we're going to run roughshod over the white-collar neighborhoods, and you should feel better about that, but I don't.
If you don't want to talk about motives, how about campaign promises? Some of the new council members, one in particular, Tony Palmieri, ran on listening to neighborhoods and wanting input from neighborhoods when he got on the Common Council. Well, to play the devil's advocate, your neighborhood appeared, he blew them off, and he gave them a lecture, basically. What happened to his campaign promise?
Yeah, good question. And to make it worse, the night of the first vote, he said, it's what's really good about the process is that the neighbors, the residents of River Mill Road will have a chance to come before the council and make their case to us. Well, of course, we couldn't do that because the city survey crews were out, within the next week already doing the preparation work, so they presumably were pulled off of other projects to get this done. And then, I was not one of the ones from the neighborhood who appeared, but I thought there were a lot of good ideas and, and reasonable concerns advanced, and basically the council did blow them off.
Yeah.
So I think that is problematic for Tony, and I hope that he does a better job of living up to his campaign promises. Another thing that he said was that we need to get away from this idea of faith-based development. And I thought that was a great line. And that what I took that to mean is we get away from faith-based, we go to fact-based. If we're going to make a decision, we pull the data in, we look at it, we evaluate the data, we do some sensitivity analysis, we set priorities, and then we do what the data tell us to do. And that is not what was done here.
When we talk about, facts and studies and so forth, I think the city would probably make the argument, Miles, that, well, we don't do studies anywhere else. We just put in sidewalks because cities have sidewalks. How would you justify a study being done for safety reasons, specifically in this neighborhood?
Well, I think that there isn't a justification for that per se, but the trail does run through the city, and parts of it are county property. Excuse me, parts are not, and I think that was Brian Bain's suggestion was, well, let's look at this whole thing. Plus, there's the Riverwalk plans. I think as we do more bridge reconstruction, there's this idea of running the trail underneath the bridge so it gets off the streets and things like that. So I don't think that you can do it just for the neighborhood. But the neighborhood didn't say there was a safety problem. The councilors who wanted the sidewalk said there was a safety problem. So I think it really is up to them to justify that there's a safety problem.
Good point.
Back to the process, how are city decisions made based on this example?
Not well. And I think that's scary. I mean, what we want in government, and I think this is true, we all want government that proceeds from principles and not from personalities. And as I said earlier, I've tried to find a principle or an explanation for why this decision was made, and I can't find one.
Okay.
And that leaves me with the personalities, although as I said before, I'm just reluctant to put words into people's mouths or to pretend that I understand what's going through their heads.
Now, Palmieri did say, based on his urban planning book, that every neighborhood and every street in a city should have a sidewalk. That was one premise, a principle thing.
Right.
He also said in his lecture that we should agree that you have beautiful houses before you have sidewalks, and you would agree with me that we'll have beautiful houses after sidewalks.
Right. The lawns won't be so good, but
Yeah. But I thought that was. Do you think every city and every neighborhood and every block should have to have sidewalks?
There's a split. Some of my neighbors feel pretty strongly about this, that they feel like we moved into this neighborhood, we like the way it looks, and we like this kind of suburban feel to it. Some of my neighbors aren't too happy with me because I say, sidewalks are not too bad. I can live with sidewalks. I just think that there are places in the city where there are real needs, where there are dangerous places. I ride my bike as much as I can, and there are places where it's taking my life into my hands to ride because there's no sidewalk. So my argument all along was, sure, River Mill Road is probably going to get sidewalks sooner or later, but let's do it based on a list of priorities or some reasonable process of evaluation.
I thought one of your residents had an interesting proposal. He said, we have a wide street. You could mark off a foot or two on one side for the bike lane and for walking lane, and that, and of course no one paid any attention to that either.
Right. And the other thing is that we don't have fences that keep people off our lawns, and there are two very large empty lots that, if people really feel scared in the neighborhood, it's city right away. They certainly have a right to use it, but nobody does because people don't feel scared being in the neighborhood. Yeah.
You said that the survey crews from the city were out there within just days of the initial vote being taken.
Right.
And we should make the point that was not the formal vote to actually install the sidewalks.
Right.
I guess, and we'll ask Mayor Tower that question, because that seems to me to be a waste of city resources. You know, I think
Right.
that's the point that you've tried to make too.
Well, it's a waste of city resources, but it is also sort of a slap in the face to citizens to say, you know, yeah, we're going to have a public hearing. Yeah, you can come talk to us, but it's already decided.
But
So,
that one, who's pushing the button on that to do that premature to the final vote?
Yeah.
I mean,
We'll find out from
We'll
Mr.
find out,
Tower.
yeah.
Maybe he knows.
Yeah.
I hope that he does. Now, the Northwestern had said, you know, that this is micromanaging on the part of the council, specifically on Mr. Esslinger's part, since he's the one who sort of instigated this. Would you agree with that?
well, yes, but he didn't do it himself. I mean, that's the thing that you have to look at.
No, but he did bring it
He
forward.
did bring it forward, but he got 4 votes, and I'm glad that you're going to ask some questions of Mayor Tower, because I think that is sort of the thing that I don't understand. I think it was pretty clear that McHugh and Palmieri would align themselves with Esslinger on this one. I thought that Frank would go a different way, and I don't really understand what the analysis is. And I've heard different theories. You know, one theory is that, well, he didn't win by much,
Yeah.
and so he needs to kind of capture some of the Esslinger vote.
You know, he gave Bain an opportunity, though, to amend his amendment where Frank seemed to say that, you know, if you'll delay it 1 year, I'm not opposed, but I think Bain had it in a 2008, 2012 category, and Tower said, I'm not, I can't support that, but Bain didn't pick up on that, and we'll have to ask him. But I got the sense that he was willing to delay it for 1 year,
Right.
but not to study it for 2 or 3.
Right.
And that's why he, in the end, went and joined the. But he clearly was the swing vote because,
Right.
you know, we didn't know.
And the other theory that I've heard is that, you know, one of the things that Frank has done, I think, to his credit, is say, you know, the buck stops here. I'm the mayor, but I'm going to take responsibility in moving the city forward. The reality of it is that he can't do that very well unless he can command some votes on the council. And so he needs to kind of make some friends and have people who will vote along with him.
What would you like to see happen here? I mean, aside from the sidewalks that are going
Yeah.
in, what would you like to see happen with the process from this point forward, Miles?
Well, I think that it's not the sidewalk process at all. It is this larger issue. I would like the people who ran and got elected to live a little more closely to their principles. I would like to see more of a data-based, you know, data-driven decision process. And we're coming up on the budget season, and you know, ordering sidewalks is easy because it doesn't take city money. You know, it's my neighbors and I are paying for this. But when the budget comes forward, there are going to have to be some trade-offs. And what I'm hoping is that we'll see more of a move towards principles and away from personalities.
Okay, all right, good. Well, we want to thank you for being here. You know, it's an interesting issue. Nobody ever wants sidewalks,
Right.
and it's, you know, people all over the country complain about sidewalks, but I think that your complaints are justified and based in some type of reason, rather than just, you know,
Well,
we
I
don't
hope
want
so.
sidewalks.
Well, I just hope it, as I said, you know, that this issue we move beyond, but going forward, that the council does listen to citizens and really listen to them, and you know, look for other ways to do things.
Cheryl, we've got water development and the Old Mercy Hospital. If the process doesn't work very well with sidewalks, is it going to work better on these bigger projects?
Well, we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll find out some of these answers to these questions from Mayor Frank Tower. We'll be right back.
We just escaped.
I escaped
I escaped
by foot.
and ran across the border.
I couldn't practice my religion.
I was put to work in forced labor camps.
If I stay in Cambodia, I would have been dead by now.
If you think differently, then you're an enemy.
If you know how to read and write, you're dead. You speak your mind, you're dead.
The only way to express what I wanted to do was to get out.
I got to the country when I was about 14 years old.
I was 20.
I was 24.
I came here with nothing. No money, no English.
America stood for freedom, it stands for freedom, and that's what all my generation, young generation, wanted to be there.
For the first time, I felt like I have a right to be on this earth.
Here, you can do whatever you want to do.
I love my life here. I feel at home.
I'm free to do what I want.
Freedom to me means my life.
you doing?
Hi.
Hi.
Have a nice day.
You too.
Thanks.
If only child abuse were this easy to recognize. If you even suspect abuse, call 1-800-4-A-CHILD. All calls are anonymous and confidential. Trust your instincts.
Poor nutrition today will increase Sarah's chances of anemia, add to her healthcare costs, sick days, even stunt her ability to learn. And the thing is, Sarah's not even born yet. Get proper nutrition before it's too late. Call or visit WIC. WIC provides nutrition information, healthcare referrals, even food. Your child has you, and you have WIC.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the second half of Eye on Oshkosh. We're now joined by Mayor Frank Tower, and we're continuing our discussion on sidewalks, in particular in the River Mill Road area. So, Frank,
yes,
you were hearing the
yes.
part of the show with Miles, so that you could respond to some of the things.
Sure, he's looking for answers, and I can completely understand.
Sure. And we appreciate your being here, especially the day after a holiday. Your vote, as Dan sort of suggested, was the swing vote on this.
Sure.
In a sense, it truly was. Can you just explain to us what your thought process was when you made that vote?
Certainly. What was brought forward to the council as a resolution initially by Paul to say we want to add this to the sidewalk projects that we'll be doing this upcoming season. And then that was the initial item that was brought to the council, and a number of people came from the River Mill and other areas to speak on that, whether or not they wanted it or not. And then from there it was voted on in the positive by majority to then add it to the list of sidewalks. And then of course it later came to the council where we were approving the actual sidewalks that we would construct. So a couple different steps in there just so you understand the process.
And as Cheryl explained with Miles, that the first vote was 5-2 to get the process going,
Right.
but the final vote was 4-3.
Correct. Brian, I think, was the one who had changed his vote.
Brian had offered an amendment, actually.
Correct. And I don't necessarily want to say change your vote is the right way, because we're voting on really different things, I think, perhaps.
That's true.
As far as Brian goes. But when it was originally brought as a resolution by Paul, and then we talked about it and we voted on in the positive to add it to the list, my initial reaction there, and what I had commented on the end, is looking at the history here, this is one of a number of different areas in the community that didn't have sidewalk, has a beautiful street, has curb and gutter, so it seemed to me to make sense that we should add sidewalks in that particular area. I'm sure we'll dive much more into timing and other things, but that was my initial thought, and I believe I expressed that as I thought this was something that should have been done some time ago, and I'm glad that it's being brought forward now. Then when we moved to the vote, where we had a number of people come to the council meeting and speak and say that a lot of them were really okay with having sidewalks in their community, it was a question of timing, and I can completely understand that. And at that particular time, because we had discussed with a resident who had come to one of Brian's Fifth Tuesday forums, it was the one out in Menominee Park. Wasn't well attended, but that's okay. And we had discussed with one of the residents, what about this? What are the thoughts here? And that's when Brian and I had discussed, well, perhaps it makes more sense to look at this particular piece of sidewalk construction in the greater context of the Wheel Wash Trail. We have the Wisconsin Street Bridge that's going to be opening not too distant future, and it made sense for this piece to be constructed against a backdrop of other things. There's a spot on Summit Avenue that doesn't have it on both sides. I used to live there, so I'm very familiar with that, as well as other areas. We've got the Congress crossing that are challenging as well. So against that backdrop, I said that makes a lot of sense. Why don't we perhaps take a look and not do it in 07 right away? Let's do it 08. The thought was perhaps 09. I wasn't terribly in favor of stretching it out that far, simply because we're going to have the Wisconsin Street Bridge constructed next year towards the end of the year. So the more we could have done to connect up the wheel wash sooner, before the bridge is done, I thought that would be a better idea. So that was the thought of, well, 07, 08 really doesn't matter to me as long as the timing works out so that it's before the bridge is constructed. It seemed to make sense to me, and then that would allow us either next season, so the 08 sidewalk construction season, to fill in some of those other other potential areas where we need to do things to improve the wheel wash and make sure it's all connected. And that was essentially why I continued to vote. There have been some talk of, was it a safety issue for Frank? It wasn't I'm afraid that there's so much traffic in that area that we're going to have accidents and incidents. I think history shows, one of the gentlemen who came forward at the council meeting, I believe, in fact, said we've never had an accident in this community. So from a strict standpoint of we have a lot of traffic, so therefore we need it, that really didn't motivate my decision. It was a connection up of the wheel wash, and again, 07, 08 really didn't matter, but it did not seem that there was support to have it happen in 08, so that's what swayed my decision to vote for it in 07. And a lot of the things that Tony had brought forward, I realize you said it was a bit of a lecture, so understandable, but some of the points he brought forward I agree with. Specifically, we are in a community that is a city, and there's going to be a point in time, as much as some people say, well, I want to have a little bit of rural city, eventually that's not going to be the case. There's going to be curb and gutter and sidewalk. There may not be concrete street. It may make more sense for an asphalt street, depending where you are. But even if you go way north to the town of Oshkosh areas that we've annexed into the city, a lot of them have all kinds of water problems where there's standing water, there's no sewer or storm sewer to take that away. There's going to be a point in time, I vision, that there'll be sidewalks and curb and gutter up there. I'm sure they probably won't be happy hearing me say that, but eventually I foresee a day where that's going to happen. And with rare occurrence would I say that there's going to be sidewalk. There are some areas where I think you could do without the sidewalk, just do curb and gutter. The council meeting right before I got on the council, so that would have been the last one before the election, there was a section that the council did a little bit of compromise on, I believe. I think it was Lark, but or maybe Arthur. But there was a section there, it was right on the river. There weren't any houses there. It didn't make sense at that particular point in time. There was nothing that was going to be connected. So the council voted to remove the sidewalk from that particular area. So just some general thoughts on sidewalks, but similar to other council members that express the idea that you live in the city, that there's going to be sidewalk everywhere eventually. So my hope is whatever we can do to continue that, we can do.
I think one of the arguments made, and rightfully so, is that the council didn't really seem to listen to the citizens who came forward. They did offer suggestions. One of the suggestions, which seemed to be a good compromise, I thought, was just putting the sidewalks on one side and leaving the inside untouched, because that just basically goes around in a circle. No one on the council even address that point at all.
Well, actually, Brian did bring it up that I believe during the council meeting that there was some thought of whether or not it would make sense to exclude the inner circle from having sidewalk versus the outside. And I can see both sides of that, but it really didn't seem like it made sense to me personally to do sidewalks in only one section. If you're going to do the sidewalks in the community, unless there's no housing or the river or the water right there, similar to what I commented on a moment ago, it just makes sense to me to have the sidewalks, the curb and gutter. I realize that's probably not the answer everyone wants to hear, or is in depth,
but it's an answer.
I mean, the principle is that they ought to have sidewalks. I guess Miles' point and the question I want to was the process correct on this? I mean, I can see getting that on a list and working down, but this kind of leapfrogged.
And that's where I think Brian and I had some concerns, and why, and Jess, in fact, provided a lot of input with a resolution just prior to that particular resolution with some idea of connecting to the north with Snell. So I think that really brought back to the city management, David Potek, Richard, that this is a definite thing that the city wants to look at, or the council wants to see happen, is where can we look at ways of making the wheel wash completely connect. Now, is that going to potentially push off some other sidewalks on, say, arterials or collectors? Yeah, there is that possibility, but I think the immediacy of the Wisconsin Street Bridge coming in and finally starting to make the wheel wash a complete connected trail, especially as we start putting in the river walk, I hope, that's really going to be a fantastic thing for the community.
Have you as a council now set a precedent with respect to ordering in sidewalks? We were talking in the first half, I'm sure you heard it, that a lot of people that I've talked with, and myself personally, I've not seen where a council member brings forward a resolution to order in sidewalks on a specific street or in a specific neighborhood.
And, go ahead.
And I guess, and now there's this precedent that I think has been set. And you've got all these other sections. Miles, brought some of the photos tonight. He's got many, many more on his blog, Miles to Go. And
I watch it every day.
and, it just seems like there are other areas, including along a city park that
I saw
the city
that.
owns. I mean, can we now expect you guys to bring forward resolutions to order in sidewalks?
Well, I think what will happen as part of the process better going forward is that we'll get the information to city staff ahead of time. So, for example, a council member wants to have a particular section have sidewalk. We would do it as part of the budget process when we're going through the CIP and discussing. I think we're going to have a lot more in-depth discussion of where sidewalks make sense, where they don't, and what are going to be the priorities. And at least I know personally, and I think Brian to a certain extent, and Jess sounds like too, the wheel wash is going to be something very important to us to get done. It's very frustrating at times, as you can well imagine, being up there, seeing large sections of the community where we don't have sidewalks. In fact, one over on Murdoch that we voted in that night, I actually drove by it down, and there were so many people that were walking up and down in that particular section that there was a trail burned in the grass. So I saw that and said, well, doggone it, we really need sidewalks here. So seeing areas where we need to backfill in, and there are some other neighborhoods similar to the River Place area, or River Mill, excuse me, where it was in that window of time where they didn't have to have the sidewalks, so the sidewalks weren't in there. I believe there's 2 or 3 other areas. So I think we want to seriously go back and look at those sections as well and say, what's the timetable on filling in these particular areas to have sidewalks too?
And along the frontage road as well. Miles hasn't had any of those pictures that I'm aware of on his website, but there are some areas of sidewalk along portions of the frontage road, and then there's others where there's nothing.
Absolutely nothing.
And
You're right.
you see people walking in the grass where they can. Just last week, I saw someone literally walking down the frontage road, and I thought, oh my God, I hope they don't get hit. So.
I saw a gentleman walking north on, I believe it was Jackson Street, just yesterday, or day before yesterday. So, yeah.
So we can expect to see sidewalks everywhere then, right?
That is, yes.
Whether they make sense or not.
Well, with rare exception.
Okay, all right. You have anything else?
Are we done with sidewalks?
Do you have anything
No,
else?
no.
All right, okay.
But it's important, and I think talking about the process and how we got there and future is...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Was I thrilled with the process? No. So I think that it shows the rest of the city council as well as the staff that we need to do it better.
Should this just be left up to the Public Works Department, though, Frank? And let them handle this?
But there are times and places where I think that people talk to us as council members and don't necessarily call up David or call up Richard and say, you need to put sidewalks here. So then I think it's a more collaborative effort where we call up David and say, hey, did you know there was a concern with this particular section? And a lot of times it's a question just of when is it going to happen, just like roads. And we can get that information for the individual so they've got better information. But there may be times when we receive some information that David or Richard, they don't know or don't have programs, so then it becomes a more collaborative effort.
No, I understand that, but I mean, do we really need a council member bringing forward a resolution to do this?
I think perhaps in the case of sidewalks specifically, that it may not have been the best route to go, so I think it's an example of perhaps a place where the council needs to make it earlier happen in the process. So not only, because I believe Miles was commenting earlier that he didn't have a whole lot of time to find that bonded contractor to get out there and do the sidewalk. So if there's more knowledge ahead of time that this is something that is potentially going to happen, that the individuals have a better understanding.
Okay.
So
The irony is the council member is not taking a request to put sidewalks in a neighborhood because the neighborhood wants it. He's bringing a request to the council to put in sidewalks where nobody in the neighborhood wants it. That's an oddity.
And a lot of the people in the city don't really care.
That's right.
So
that's different.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And it's interesting with all of the decisions we make at the council level. Nothing fills the council chambers like discussion of when we're going to put in sidewalks. But I can understand because it's very impactful to the resident. It's something they're going to see every day for as long as they own that home, and it's going to be right there in front of them. So I can understand.
I want to talk about hiring policies.
Okay, fire away.
City recently hired a head person for the senior center, a new airport manager.
Well, the airport manager would be county.
Okay, county, but he's been hired.
Yes, that's my understanding.
And a new chief of police. And all three of them were done totally in the dark. There was no citizen open process on any of them. As mayor, who kind of ran on open government, does this kind of upset you?
Well, the one for fire and police does, because the candidates that we have were younger guys.
Okay.
And so we're going to be with those chiefs potentially for quite a period of time. So the challenge with the way specifically hiring the police chief and the fire chief happens in the community versus, say, with the senior center is there's a separate committee, the Police and Fire Commission, that is put together, and those individuals are on there for 5-year terms, and they're appointed by the mayor and then ratified by the council. And just because there are the potential for complaints, because especially with the police, they deal with force, and some people can have challenges with that at times. There's the separate committee that's set up for hiring and firing as well.
It's a statutorily separate committee,
exactly.
to keep these positions out of politics in a sense.
Correct.
But the hiring policy was done by your city resource person, just like with the rest. The
Correct.
city
And
must have set the policy for how they were going to be interviewed.
Well, no, actually, the Police and Fire Commission were offered a number of different options. There was a meeting of the Police and Fire Commission that was open to the public that I was at, because I was concerned as well. What's going to be the process? And the newspaper had concerns about what are the next steps, what's going to be happening, and it seemed to happen quickly. And so I went to that particular meeting, and John, the personnel individual, outlined a number of different ways that the individuals could go at P&F. Do you want to have it over one day, a couple days? What portion do you want to put out there? Do you want to take the credentials of the individual candidates, at that time we had 5, and put them on the city website and have some other information available? And again, all open, public, and it was the decision of the Police and Fire Commission that they would prefer to do it as has been done in the past, which was essentially what had happened, which was they went into, it was a total of 3 separate meetings that were closed, of course. And what was a little different this time versus the last time, is my understanding, I wasn't here when we hired our last chief, was that normally, or not normally, statutorily, all that has to happen is the P&F committee gets together and makes a decision based on a number of different criteria. This time around, what they did was add 2 more groups, would be the best way to describe them. One was a community group, and the other was a group of peers. So they had a chief, the fire chief was there, they had a couple of individuals from outside the area, other chiefs and such, and then they had some community members. I don't have the list off the top of my head, I think it was 5 or 6. And the Police and Fire Commission were part of at least the community, or I believe the peer part, watching in the background, so that there could be some real great questions asked of the candidates from a completely different perspective, so they could weed it down to the 2 candidates or the 1 candidate. No one was really sure, after having weeded it down to the 5, what would they come up with 1 or 2, or how would it net come out? I was hoping that there would be a little bit more information put out, like for example the questions. What were the questions that the different groups asked, and other things. But because P&F is set up as a separate group statutorily, I can't say anything as the mayor, because it would look like I or a council member might be changing the process. I did want to speak at the P&F committee meeting I was at, but there was no opportunity because it wasn't a public open meeting to speak at. So,
but you can appoint new members to the P&F
yes,
committee,
I can.
and sunshine might be, a
criteria
that you might want to put on the table.
No, it will be.
Okay, well that's.
Well, and speaking of the Police and Fire Commission, District Attorney Christian Gossett recently said that the meeting notice for the closed session of the P&F Commission was flawed. And this is the 3rd time in recent history, just in the last year or 2, where the city has kind of gotten its hand smacked a little for, meeting notices and holding potentially illegal meetings and so forth. Is this a concern of yours, Frank, about the city attorney?
Well, not only the city attorney, but Richard and everyone in City Hall, to make sure, as you said earlier, we've got some sunshine showing in. I did speak with Christian literally the day after that came out, because he and I were in communication with just what's going on with P&F, so that he had some idea. Clearly, working with the new chief is something that's going to be something he has to deal with on a daily basis. So he was concerned about the process and making sure that we got the best potential candidate possible as our new chief. So yes, it's concerning for me me as well that we make sure that we've got everything noticed properly. What is noticed is what actually is going to happen. There was a redevelopment authority meeting, I believe, Monday evening, and we had to change some of the wording there because it wasn't as specific as it should be. So that was changed as part of the notice. So yes, very concerning.
What steps can you as mayor or the city council as a body of its own do to ensure that this kind of thing doesn't continue happening?
Well, we keep putting pressure on Richard and the rest of the staff that you've got to err on the side of public disclosure, and if there's going to be a situation where you think that that's not going to happen, then we need to not have the meeting or we need to take a step back. And considering some of the things that happened, as you commented on in the past, I think that city staff is well aware of that, what happened specifically with P&F. I don't know if that came from John or if they came from Warren specifically, but it's something that can't happen again, period.
Okay. It's the rapidity of it that's troublesome.
You bet.
There must be some crank or lever or that's not listening or working over there, because you're concerned, we're concerned, but it just keeps happening, and that's disturbing. I think
it is.
What more can I say? Okay, let's turn to access.
Okay.
And the City Planning Commission.
You bet.
They've set up new conditions, I guess, for the waterfront. I guess it'll come to the council at the next meeting. Is the delay or the new procedure or the extension of time?
Correct.
Yeah.
Essentially, there was a reorganization of the timetable as to when access had to have certain values established for the income or the tax revenue.
I don't know whether you've seen it or not, but do those new conditions seem acceptable to you?
Yeah, it's the same amount. It just the access folks came, Tim specifically, essentially to the and was at the redevelopment authority meeting initially, and that was on Monday as well. And he essentially expressed that he wanted to come now because of the timetable. Things took a little longer, and he would not want to come, say, a year or two down the road and say, well, I'm not going to make this timetable. He wanted to be realistic with when he thought the values could be established, so that seemed reasonable to me, but the overall value is still the same.
He says he wants to break ground in October. You think that's reasonable, and if it doesn't happen, what would be your response?
Well, I think that's really up to them as far as what they think is going to make sense. I know they have an aggressive timetable and plan. Do I think they can do it? It sounds like he has the necessary people and things in place to make it happen. Whether it's October or if it slips to November or December, we're talking about something that the community is going to have for the next 25, maybe 50 plus years. So if it's a month or two delayed, I'm not going to lose any sleep over it, as long as he still makes and his group still makes the necessary timetable with evaluation.
Okay. The State of the City address. We recently heard that. The Northwestern called it a snooze.
Okay.
It really wasn't very riveting as far as, and not that those ever can be, but I think a lot of us, certainly I, was expecting more than what we really heard. I mean, it just seemed to be kind of a recap of some of the street projects, a snapshot of street projects upcoming. Really didn't have much of any kind of meat to it at all. Were you happy with the State of the City address?
I think it had a lot of meat, but not perhaps the meat that people were looking for. The other thing that this really goes back to is some goal setting by the council. The council had established the goal of Richard should do a State of the City speech. But I think what we needed to do, I wasn't on at that time, but I'll take responsibility because we'll be setting goals again in the not too distant future, is what do we want to see come out of that? Not just give us a State of the City, what do we want to let the citizens know is happening? So there wasn't real specificity there. And I think the next time around, and we'll have a less period of time to the next one because it would be in February, and that's when they usually would be. Of course, after seeing that one take place, I'm thinking maybe it makes sense to have one in February and then have one at the 6-month mark to say, well, here's where we're going at, or here's where we've gotten to. So that's something I'm going to at least potentially offer up is maybe we need an update to see where we're doing at the halfway mark. But getting back to the actual one, it really gave a lot of citizens an an idea of some of the big things that are happening. I get a lot of questions about 41. Is 6th lane actually going to happen, or is it not going to happen? How are we going to do the overpasses? What's going on there? And it provided a definite timetable for some fantastic things. The next 7 to 8 years in Oshkosh, it's just going to be crazy with the road construction and the improvements that are going to be made to the infrastructure. So I think that's where Richard was coming from that. Were there some things that weren't included? One of the snoozers, I think a lot of people would think from their perspective, but not mine, is talking about some of the water projects we have, which they weren't included that I would like to see next time around. You kind of forget when you turn on the faucet or flush the toilet, all of the infrastructure that goes place. It's buried in the ground. You kind of forget about it.
With our bills going up, though, Frank, we're not going to forget about those projects too easily.
But people want to see what they're getting for their dollars, so
That's true.
I think that would be good. But perhaps a little bit more information about other things happening in the community at the front end. And Richard was really concerned about not having it too long. And I think that's something that we as a council need to say, if it's 45 minutes, if it's 60 minutes, if it's an hour and 15 minutes, that's fine. And perhaps maybe break it down into some more grouped sections where we say, all right, even more than Richard did, where we say, we're going to talk about things that have happened a little bit in this particular section. Or maybe break it down in the community by what's happening downtown, what's happening on the east side. We've got some great things going there. The west side, we've got huge development, Lowe's. There's rumor potential of a Best Buy and some other things happening over there. So there may be a couple of different approaches. So I think the council, or at least me specifically, and perhaps Burke, the deputy mayor, will have some discussion with Richard. How do you think we can make this better next year?
Sure. And, even including, even if it's just a couple of minutes, talking about some of the big boxes that are sitting empty that, we read about in the newspaper, as we have recently. But, it would have been nice if we had heard about some of those things happening as well.
Sure.
You've been mayor for, I didn't count the days, but 75 days, 3 months.
I'm not counting the days, but
what's been your biggest surprise so far, both on the upside and the downside?
Well, I guess not really prepared for, so I suppose in that respect, surprises. I did not expect to have as much interaction with city staff as I do. As a council member, I didn't have anywhere near the amount of interaction as I do. And that I talked to Richard perhaps every couple of days. I talked to Warren at least once a week. I talked to Jackson a couple of times a week, David, all the other staff members. Just, what's going on, what's happening, because I get asked questions, and I didn't anticipate that much interaction. I figured it'd be 10 to 15 hours of my life per week, so I'm about budget for that. I just didn't know how that would be filled. The other is during the council meetings, having never run a council meeting before, seeing it from the sidelines, as a council member, you have a lot of opportunity to think about things. And, how am I going to do on this, and what are the interactions there? As mayor, you don't have that. You really need to come into that meeting. I never like to come into any meeting with any firm decision on anything, because anything can happen at a council meeting. We get new information from citizens or staff, or a council member brings up a question that spurs a little bit of dialogue that changes someone's mind. But as the mayor, you've got to be ready to make a decision fairly quickly, so you have to have your research that much more ready to go, because you're not only taking care of your decisions, but you're running that meeting. And I did not anticipate. One would think, well, why didn't you? I thought I would have a little more time there, but that's okay.
Right. Well, I think you're doing a good job.
Well,
thank you. Keep it up, and thanks very much for being here. We're out of time. We'll have you back when you can have an hour.
Very good. Sounds great.
Thanks.
And thanks also to Miles and to the crew and to Dan, as well as to all of you at home. We'll see you next time. Until then, take good care. Keep your eye on us. We've got our eye on Oshkosh.